Part 7 of Chapter 14 investigates the role of fever and the physiological and adaptive basis of fever. There's two evolutionary explanations for fever. One is that the fever represents a manipulation of the host by the pathogen. So in this case, what's happening is that the pathogen is causing this increased temperature in the host in such a way that actually benefits the pathogen. So it's for the pathogen's benefit, not the host's benefit. Now, if this is true, then a rational treatment for the disease would be to reduce the fever, because by reducing the fever, you would then also be reducing the pathogen's reproductive rate. On the other hand, it may be that fever is actually the host's adaptive defense against the pathogen. By elevating temperature, it actually decreases the pathogen's growth and reproductive rate, and it actually might also facilitate and enhance the host's immune response when we have these higher temperatures. So now, if this is true, then reducing fever would be a harmful treatment, because the treatment is an adaptive function from the host. It's obviously important that we look at these two different possible scenarios and understand what is at play here, because how we treat fever depends on whether or not it's actually an adaptive defense by the host or an adaptive defense by the pathogen. So a study by Kluger et al. Advocates the second hypothesis, that fever is actually an adaptive response by the host to elevate its own immune system and then also to reduce or limit the reproductive rate of the pathogen itself. When we look at the physiological mechanisms in the iguanas, one thing to keep in mind is that they're ectotherms. In this case, when we look at fever in this ectotherm, it's a behavioral fever. They are essentially choosing certain environments to allow their temperature to rise. So it's not just a physiological consequence of the fever. They are seeking out environments that then allow their body temperature to go up. Is it adaptive? Is a iguana seeking out a warmer environment when it's ill? Is that an adaptive response? Or once again, could it be a behavioral manipulation by the pathogen, where the pathogen is changing their behavior, causing them to seek out these warm environments, but it's still better for the pathogens? They infected these iguanas with different pathogens, and then the iguanas that were infected actually moved to warmer places to increase their body temperature. One of the things that we see over here is this change that we have. So here we have those that were injected with saline in the gray, before and after, dark and light gray. And then we have those that were injected with bacteria before they were injected and after, in the red and the pink. We can see with the gray that those that were injected with saline have not really any difference on their higher end temperature. So the warmest environments they sought out were not really different, and then the coolest environments they sought out were not really different. Same is not true though for the ones that were injected with bacteria. Here we see that before injection and after there are significant differences. Those that were injected with bacteria definitely seek out warmer locations, both on the highest end of the spectrum, the upper limit that they preferred, and down here on the lower limit that they preferred. So those that were injected with bacteria definitely sought out these warmer environments. The second thing we can ask is, what was the consequence of seeking out those warmer environments? We see over here in the far right is the environments that they were allowed to seek out, and then what the survivorship is for those individuals. Notice infected iguanas that were not permitted to find these warmer environments down here, these cooler temperature graphs here, there was a much lower survival. So the percent survival is much lower. Where they were allowed to seek out these 40 and 42 degree environments, their survivorship increased, and even higher in 42 than in 40. So this suggests that being able to seek out and find these warm environments actually elevated their survivorship. So what they're doing here is a thermoregulation mechanism very similar to mammals, but with a different mechanism, because it's a behavioral thermoregulation, not a physiological one. Then what they did is they also gave iguanas medications that have aspirin-like characteristics that would reduce fever. What they found is some of them, even when they were given these aspirin-like drugs, still developed this behavioral fever. So they still sought out and went to the warm environments, And when they did, they survived. Those that did not develop a behavioral fever typically died. So those that were allowed to develop this behavioral fever and seek out the warm environments had a higher survivorship. Fever is a little bit harder to study in endotherms. There's a couple of problems. One is it's harder to manipulate the temperature of an endotherm because we will just adjust our temperature to what is optimal for us. So it's hard to keep our body temperature at a certain range. The other thing is that drugs that reduce fever could have other effects on the immune system that are independent of the fever itself. If we use medications that reduce fever, we don't know if the outcome is the actual reduction in temperature or is it some other effect on our physiology. We know that fever increases both body temperature, but it also increases metabolic rate. So is it the body temperature that is having the effect or is it this metabolic rate? So we have to tease those two things apart. A study by Bannett tried to do that. He implanted rats with cooling devices and then he infected them with salmonella. And he used two different cooling devices. One was planted in the hypothalamus, and then the other was planted in the spinal cord. The one that was planted in the hypothalamus, what it would do is it would actually allow the rats to go ahead and develop high fevers, but it wouldn't change their metabolic rate. So we can induce fever without the increase in metabolic rate. And in this case, the control rats survived better than the ones with fevers. So if we had a high fever that really all it did was increase temperature, those rats did not do well. The control rats did better. On the other hand, if we implant it in the spinal cord, what that does is allows us to increase the metabolic rate without increasing the temperature. So again, he's teased these two things apart. And in this particular case, if we can just elevate metabolic rate and not elevate temperature, we actually do see higher survival rates of those rats compared to those with normal metabolic rates. And Bannett also found that rats that had the highest fevers had the lowest rates of survival. Rats with the highest metabolic rates had the highest survival. So these data suggest that the key here is metabolic rate rather than elevated temperature. It suggests that maybe there is something else going on. When we elevate our metabolic rate, we may be increasing our immune response, and the elevated temperature might just be a consequence of that. So it may not be that our body's really trying to elevate temperature, it's trying to elevate metabolic rate, but temperature is coming along with that. Another study that was done on humans was done with cold viruses, and in this case, they took volunteers and they infected them with cold virus, common cold. Then half of the individuals took a placebo and half of them took an over-the-counter anti-fever medication. What we see in the far left here is the placebo versus these different over-the-counter medications. What we're looking at on our dependent axis here is basically nasal stuffiness. We can see that those that actually took the placebo reported less stuffiness than all of the other over-the-counter medications. In the middle, they took these different groups and then they looked to see the level of antibodies being produced to the virus. And once again, we can see that the placebo group is actually producing more antibodies to the virus than any of the other over-the-counter medication groups. And then in the last one here, they looked at circulating monocytes, and you can also see that the placebo group showed a drop in the circulating monocytes. It may be that medications, these medications over here, prevent some of the monocytes from moving from the bloodstream into the infected tissues. So normally your monocytes would go from the bloodstream into an infected tissue and to fight off that infection. So when we take these over-the-counter medications, those monocytes they're not leaving the bloodstream to go into those tissues. The placebo group was. So in all three of these measures, it looked like the placebo group was actually doing better at countering the effects of the common cold than the over-the-counter medications were. Now, what we don't really know, because they didn't really show that many of these patients ran a fever at all, if the placebo group was more likely to run a fever, then we could say that the fever was adaptive. But again, we didn't really see differences in fever in these groups. So in this case, it probably was not due to fever because they weren't really running a fever. So there must be some other types of things going on. The idea here is that these anti-fever medications, while they might eliminate fever to some extent, although we didn't see drastic differences, they do interfere a little bit with the immune response to the cold. So these data alone would suggest that taking anti-fever medications for a common cold may not be a good strategy. However, we have to be careful to make a general statement like that because more research is probably needed on the adaptive significance of fever. While fever might be adaptive in some circumstances, maybe it isn't in others. So it might be a mistake to always say that, well, running a fever is a good thing, don't take fever-reducing medications, let the fever run its course. But that may not be true for all different infections. So if we do have some bacteria out there that actually do reproduce faster at higher temperatures, then that's not a good strategy. And it may be, again, that not all pathogens are the same. Some pathogens might have higher reproductive rates at higher temperatures and others might not. We also have to keep in mind that even if fever might be beneficial with respect to some of our physiological processes, it actually could be detrimental with respect to others. So we do know that excessive fevers can cause permanent tissue damage, which can include stroke and neurological damage. So while some level of fever might be beneficial, excessively high fevers might not. So again, we need to be careful making just a very blanket statement about whether or not fever is a beneficial adaptive function for a host or not.